Welcome to the GOTA virtual conference. Scan the QR code on the left to participate in our silent auction. The silent auction will run from October 1st to October 29th of 2020. Scan the QR code on the right to go to the GOTA online store. Thank you to our 2020 sponsors. Platinum level sponsor, the Shepherd Center. Gold level sponsors, All About Kids Therapy Services in the University of St. Augustine. And silver level sponsor, Hanger Clinic.
Everyone, welcome. We're really excited for tonight's presentation. We have two presenters with us tonight. Dr. Maitra is a professor and the chair of the Department of Occupational Therapy at Georgia State in Atlanta, Georgia. He is an occupational therapist and a cognitive neuroscientist. Currently, he is working to understand the relationship between space cognition and the occupation of living in the community with older adults. He publishes in peer-reviewed national and international journals and regularly presents in national and international forums. Dr. Maitra received research support from federal agencies like the National Science Foundation and the National Parkinson's Foundation, besides intramural funding. He is also a fellow of the American Occupational Therapy Association and has served on the board of trustees for the American Occupational Therapy Foundation for 6 years.
How are you?
We also have Emily Buchman. She has a background in psychology and occupational therapy. She worked as a clinical professional counselor in community mental health prior to pursuing a degree in occupational therapy. As an occupational therapist, she worked for 9 years in hospital-based rehabilitation settings. Her primary area was rehabilitation for individuals with spinal cord injury, but she has also worked in general rehab settings where she treated individuals with a more diverse array of conditions. In 2017, she began teaching in the Department of Occupational Therapy at Georgia State University. She developed the assessment and intervention courses focused on mental health and neurorehabilitation. She received approval for an interdisciplinary international study abroad course for PT and OT students to provide care to individuals in Costa Rica. She also teaches in the area of assistive technology and is involved in one research project focused on instructional design and other examining the impact of different wheelchairs for mobility for individuals with strokes. So I'm going to let them take it away with their presentation.
There we go. All good? Okay, great. Okay, well, thanks for coming tonight. So Dr. Maitra and I are going to talk about motor learning principles in neurorehabilitation and really knowledge translation of those motor learning principles. So we have a prepared presentation, but we actually want this to be dynamic and participatory tonight. So it's kind of going to be an open discussion. You can leave your camera off even as you're chatting and discussing, or feel free to turn it on. But we will go through some concepts and then talk about it and get some perspective from the audience as well. So this is just images from Georgia State University. As Kelsey mentioned, we're both faculty at Georgia State University. And so this is our current cohort that is training right now in the neurorehabilitation course. Here, hopefully you guys recognize the awesome legislative day that we had at the Capitol this year. I think we talked about that at the business meeting the other week. So after today's session, we're going to just hopefully have a refined understanding of motor learning. So we want to talk about the principles related to motor learning and also assessment and intervention related to that. So hopefully you'll be able to recognize how changes in behavior and altered performance in your clients are indicators of skill learning in relation to OT treatment. We also want to talk about the key methods of instruction that promote motor learning during OT sessions, and hopefully get some take on all of you expert clinicians out there as well for what you've seen in practice. And then we will also talk in the beginning about a case. So thankfully, YouTube, you can find pretty much anything. So we have pulled just a client from University of Michigan, we'll give props to. And it's a woman that we'll see next. And then we want to talk and just kind of weave concepts of motor learning throughout the session in relation to this client and your clients as well. So we can just reflect on practice and used evidence-based concepts, bringing it back to practice. So this, I will say, is, so this is the case that we've pulled, and we're just going to use it as a jumping off kind of spot for talking about motor learning, and to give a demonstration of what a client may look like who might benefit from motor learning and how that sort of comes about in practice. So after we watch this video, I'll just give you preparation that we're going to kind of develop an occupational profile together, in discussion after we watch this. So just kind of pay attention to her and her interests, her strengths, her barriers, and then we can talk about it as a group and kind of develop her as a case.
911. Hi there. There's a woman that she's really, really ill. She puked. She complained of a headache. I almost feel like maybe stroke symptoms or something. I'm not certain.
I just remember saying I just felt a burst behind my eye. And not until she repeated it to the 911 operator. She just said she felt a burst behind her eye. And I was like, oh crap, that doesn't sound good. And that was the last I remember.
In general, the continuum of care post-stroke is utmost important in the beginning. So with Barb, she had inpatient rehab followed by home therapy, and then she started here with us after her home therapy. So when she came, she was sort of functioning from a compensatory framework. She was not using her left arm at all. It was very spastic. It was fisted. Her elbow was flexed. She was not able to open it or use it in any way, so she sort of discarded it mentally and physically. Good. You're going to go straight up way over your head. Good. And now touch the back of your head. Yeah. Beautiful, beautiful. So you're getting there. That's good. Now try to go all the way up again. So reach for the ceiling. Look, I've got it here. It's okay. And then come down. Good. Now you see your hair. See if you can fix it. Fix it with lefty.
I try to do the exercises at home. Like I said, I've got exercises everywhere every room. Leg extensions, arm extensions. They're everywhere. I can't believe how far I've come. And it's like Kathy was saying, it's that path, through the woods. You gotta walk that path, you gotta build that pathway in your brain. It's repetition.
So she continued to regain the function and continue to be motivated and improve, brain-wise to recover.
They said, Hendrika is always going back to where I was, which was when we first got you up, Barb. It took 4 of us, 3 of us to hold you and 1 to hold your head up because I was like a rag doll. Dr. Pandy, he said, don't recover to live. Live while you recover. And I love that. I want to have opportunities of things that I can do. Like when I first got my bike, I rode a mile just to see how it would feel in the sub, right? So then my goal was, okay, I'm gonna do 6 miles a day. That's my goal. And then and then I did 7. I'm like, okay, then I'll do 7 miles a day. And then that turned into 10. I guess the biggest thing that I've come away with, never give up.
Okay, so hopefully we got a little bit of a sense of Barb through that. We obviously don't have a full client in that 3 minutes that we watched, but we did see a lot of images that help us build who she is as a person. And then also we observed a lot of her movement capabilities and also maybe found some challenges there. So as a group, you know, when I thought about this, I thought I could probably type in here and make a slide, but probably since I'm in presenter mode, I can't. So I'm going to jot down some ideas. If Dr. Maitra, you can kind of help me in the chat and get some ideas from people. So what were some concerns related to our occupational functioning? And some of these things we may have to develop on our own as a group, and then others may be more prevalent from that video that we watched. So does anyone have ideas about what some of her current concerns might be related to occupational functioning?
Maybe efficiency in dressing or subluxation or pain.
Mm-hmm.
Are you talking about early on with her rehab, or they're the later stages?
I'd say the later stages, maybe.
I would just say her mental well-being.
Okay. Can you expand there, Irma?
Well, how, I mean, she seemed very optimistic and positive and the way she talked, but just like what is she doing spiritually, or what is she, whichever way she chooses to take care of herself that way.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great.
Helps.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
In the chat, we also have fixing her hair, getting back strength and endurance, social and family support.
Perhaps driving, since she was using an alternative mode of transportation.
Mm-hmm.
We also have difficulty using her left upper extremity for functional tasks, such as maybe returning to work.
Great. Okay, so that's, I think, a good jumping off point. So it sounds like in my little scribble here that we have some basic ADLs even. So she, we saw there that she had trouble even reaching up fully to fix her hair. So I think somebody mentioned that. So some of her ADLs may be challenged. And then a lot of her more complex IADLs as well. And then people also mentioned some of the other like kind of client factors. So strength and endurance, things like that. So hopefully strength and endurance contributing to what she would want to be able to do functionally. Good. So what do you think she might be successful in already in her occupations?
Leisure.
Okay. Good. So we saw her doing quite a bit of leisure and taking it as, you know, the cycling and the swimming, kayaking. We saw her doing a lot of outdoor activities. Anything else that anyone picked up on?
She seems to be a good self-advocate.
Mm-hmm.
And her complex or her executive functioning appears like it's functioning rather high.
Good.
So one thing also like remarkable is that if you think about the first descriptions that she had a feeling of burst or light bulb behind her eyes. So that might indicate that that's a sort of like a frontal stroke or like frontal parts, which is a motor area, but it's surprising what Veronica was referring to, that she recovered probably cognitively faster than the motor. And the literature suggested that if you're cognitively intact, your motor recovery is more than usual, because you understand more, and then you understand therapist directions more, which you will be talking about in some parts, sometimes about the cognitive processing in motor learning. So that is one, like, so this concept of cognitomotor connections in terms of rehab recovery, that's what I'm seeing, that the recovery and cognition is faster than the motor. So that's why probably motor follows his cognitive understanding of the situation.
Great. Anything else notable? I don't have my chat box, so I can't see quite well. Let's see.
Veronica suggested difficulty using her left upper extremity for functional tasks, such as maybe return to work.
Okay, great.
And Emily, I can kind of help you keep up with the chat box. I'll read those off as they come in.
Thank you,
Okay.
Kelsey. Okay, so let's see, we were on successful applications. Okay, so barriers. I think some people already noted some of the barriers, like strength and endurance, perhaps range of motion. Any other barriers that people want to note with her?
It seemed in the beginning, at least, she might have had some left-sided neglect.
Okay.
She also appeared to continue to have some impairment with her dynamic standing, balance, and functional mobility with asymmetry.
Good. Great. So what do you guys see as her values and interests?
Health and an active lifestyle.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of outdoorsy things.
It would seem that some of those leisure occupations might help with the strengthening and her confidence in doing things.
Mm-hmm. So both the kind of emotional growth and, function.
Right.
Great. So we would need to, from this segment, build her occupational history or life experiences, obviously. Can you guys, do you have any notion of anything like that? And we can also build that for later discussion too, if anybody wants to offer anything up, whether we saw it or not.
Someone added in the chat, she is a caretaker for older parents or has her own children.
Okay. Do you guys want to give her a profession?
Camp counselor.
She's an educator.
Okay. So that helps. That gives us some ideas about what she needs to do. Great. How about her routines, roles, habits?
She looks like she's lived a healthy lifestyle. I mean, she's not overweight. She looks good.
Mm-hmm. Great. And so if we gave her the role of like an educator, then we know that she probably has to, engage in her regular daily living stuff, somehow, get to work and have those routines in the morning, all those kinds of things too, right?
In the chat we have, I like how she seemed to incorporate her home exercise program into her typical routines.
Mm-hmm.
I think another role is she would have to be able to organize lesson plans or activities for whoever she's educating, and be able to come up with the proper sequence and the activities that would be used.
Seems like she would be really receptive to therapeutic recommendations. Seems like she'd be receptive.
Right, judging by how she had things all over her house, it seems like it, right?
Definitely.
That's what we want to see, right, in our clients.
And she must be good at multitasking, given the things that her life requires.
Great. And then how about environmental supports or barriers? Any thoughts there? We did see her home environment, right? Or what we think is her home environment.
So she lives near University of Michigan, so Ann Arbor, maybe weather.
Okay.
And it looks like she lived near nature areas for leisure activities.
And then people already mentioned as well, you know, she has, sounds like social support, perhaps if she has parents and children, we've decided, right? Some responsibilities there as well. And what did you guys think about when she was in her home and, you know, she said, I have things everywhere. Did you get a take maybe on her kind of her living style, at least just at a gross level?
Very devoted for continued recovery. She has exercises everywhere.
Great. All right. Anything I missed, Kelsey?
Nope.
All right. Okay, so we've painted at least a little bit of a picture of Barb, and it seemed like you guys picked up on quite a few aspects that are going to lead to holistic treatment, and that can then inform, you know, our practice and what we do with her. So if we are finding, you know, client-centered activities, then hopefully we have a little jumping off point. And also having an understanding of her environment, her supports, her barriers, all those kinds of things. So as we are moving forward, we might develop her a little bit more. And you guys also capitalized a good bit on a lot of the client factors that are going to impact her recovery overall too. So we'll jump into some of those points and then hopefully kind of weave Barb throughout, since we all have somewhat of a similar notion than of a client. So we'll start off first here just with just kind of defining motor learning. So that's our primary topic. So really developing and altering learned movement patterns over the course of repeated experiences. So a key to motor learning is that there ends up being a relatively permanent change in those movement patterns over time. So we can kind of hone in on the fact that we need repeated experiences. It's going to lead to relatively permanent change, and then that it's really like a process, so it develops. And motor learning overall is just, it's essential for occupational performance. So through our natural development, we have motor learning going on all the time through natural development. And then in terms of neurorehabilitation, which we'll focus a little bit more on today, also after a loss of function. So if we just think about the normal kind of, you know, developmental sequence, and, you know, if we go back to infancy and you have a child that really in the beginning doesn't do a whole lot, right? Doesn't move, doesn't interact with the environment. But then through time, a baby learns how to roll, they learn how to maybe roll over, push up on prone. Eventually they come to standing, and then eventually walk at some point. When we're talking about kind of a typically developing child. So there's lots of occupations. I mean, they have functional mobility. They also development, in the sense of how they interact when they want to feed themselves. So there's a whole progression there as well. So at some point, they have to figure out how to move to do these targeted skills that they want to do. And so that process of motor learning develops through practice and repetition. So a child doesn't first just one day walk up, stand up and then eventually take steps. No, when they first do it, they're wobbly. It can be kind of comical. They may take a step, fall on their bottom. And then through time and repetition and whatever kind of supports the environment affords them, then they're able to develop fluid, smooth movements that allow them to, ambulate. Then I'll remember things, even when they master that one skill, you think about that static environment they're in. So probably through the course of this, I'll tell you a lot of my less successful times in life as both a person and an occupational therapist. But I still remember a time when I was with my son at the park and he was very young and he was steady on his feet. He was fine. And then he went over one of those wobbly bridges. And I think I moved it a little too much for what he could handle at that point in his development. And he, of course, lost his balance and then fell. And so that was one of my less glamorous moments as a mother, of course. But, through I over anticipated his functional capabilities at that point. He just had not developed that, that ability to have those altered, perturbations that he could withstand. But then, I see development, more development. I have a daughter who's 5, and in COVID, we've been doing lots of activities at home. And she's learned how to hopscotch. She did not do that. One day we did chalk, and at first she couldn't do it. She just kind of wasn't coordinated enough to jump with 1 foot, then 2 feet. And then, I left and I went to do something. And then even that day, I never saw her do it. But about 3 days later, she was hopscotching, doing that movement pattern all over the house. So she, through practice and repetition, just figured it out. It clicked and she could do it. So you see it just kind of all the time in typical development. So with our clients, we need to reinforce all that practice. We need to try and find those skilled behaviors and targeted movements that are going to help them achieve their functional goals and the things that they want to be able to do for themselves again. So the motor learning principles, they have different theoretical constructs that come from neurophysiology and cognitive behavioral psychology. So decades ago, they had the sensory motor approaches that were prevailing. So treatments like PNF and NDT, which a lot of therapists still use in treatment. And so those were treatments that were focused on more on sensory stimulation and how that impacted movement when you applied sensory stimulation to joints and muscles. So with NDT, there's, a lot of handling and positioning to try and alter tone. PNF, they have the spiral motions and diagonal movement patterns that then hopefully through that sensory stimulation, so sensory motor, then impacts the motor response. So if you provide joint input to the body, then the idea behind that was that you would elicit more normalized movements. So even for PNF, they utilized so both tactile feedback and then also verbal feedback is one of the key constructs of that. So they're also integrating different, sensory cueing to elicit that motion. So those are some of the, some of the foundational approaches. Then also social learning models feed into current contemporary motor learning approaches. So Bandura was one of the fathers of social learning. So I don't know if you guys remember the Bobo doll experiments, but there was a Bobo doll in rooms and children basically kind of like learned basically aggressive behavior just by watching other children display aggressive behavior towards the Bobo doll. So the idea translates now into motor learning in the sense that we can observe others and hopefully mimic those, those movements as we demonstrate things for our clients, and also provide verbal instruction. So that's what we do as OTs, right? We teach people new ways and different ways of doing things, and provide them ideas for how to move to do the things that they want to do. So with social learning, there's also kind of the premise that when you use that, people learn by watching individuals that are more similar to them. So for us, if this translates into, how we provide these demonstrations to our clients, if we are more similar, then that can sometimes lead to a better, replication of those movements by the client. And then also with typical social learning model, they found that if the child has the perception that the behavior that they also elicit is going to be rewarded, then they're more likely to elicit that behavior. So we can use also positive reinforcement with our clients in motor learning. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Maitra. He's going to go through some of the principles now of motor learning. Dr. Maitra.
Thank you, Dr. Buchman. So we try to keep this presentation as conversational as it can be, and you guys can chime in anytime that you have a question, sort of comment, personal experience, etc. I know all of you have studied, probably taken a continuing educations on motor learning principles and or motor control theories, etc. So I will not go into, we decided not to go into scientific details of it, but we'll touch on the essential concepts. And if you are interested, then we can go deeper with evidence and all these kinds of things. The first, we titled this topic as a principles. By definition, principles are the things, that is, when you say that the motor learning principles, that means those principles have been backed up by some sort of research evidence. So those are not assumptions or hypotheses. Those are generated out of several observations. So that is one thing we have to remember throughout these things, that these, whatever we are talking about, those are backed up by several evidences. But we are not going to talk about all the motor learning principles. And at the end of my sections, I will share you one of the recent review of literature on meta-analysis that came out by a Belgium group who identified, who scanned through all the existing literature in the animal model as well as in the human model, what they published a paper in 2019, I think in the middle of 2019, in one of the highly respected journal called Human Frontiers Neuroscience, which has a 3.69 impact factor. That means it is highly regarded and highly referred. And it is freely downloadable from the internet, Human Frontier Science, and I will share you that. They identified, and they call this, and this whole article, the meta-analysis and the review article is on stroke. So they identified principles of motor learning in the population of stroke. And they identified 15 principles that we can use in rehabilitation, applying motor learning principles. I will touch on some of those, and then I will bring up the article and then go over quickly some of the interesting like assumptions on those articles and give you some idea that how you can like use those principles in your practice. And then Dr. Buchman will take over and go through some of the assessment and intervention idea. So in the hierarchical theory and heterarchical theory are two broad concepts in motor control and motor learning. So hierarchical theory is based on the idea that there is a hierarchical system in the brain through which we operate. And in broadly that speaking, that is based on reflex sort of theory. Now, you know, reflex means involuntary response to a stimulus. In 1932, Sherrington discovered this reflex, and he thought and then postulated all our reactions are nothing but chain of reflex. That means when you put one stimulus, you get one involuntary response. And at that time, they didn't know what is voluntary and involuntary, but that response will become a stimulus for the next action. So, and he got Nobel Prize in 1932 for that. So it seems to us that all of these things, whenever we intend to do something, it comes from somewhere in the brain, and then it goes through like a second tier of processing, which is in the brainstem, then spinal cord, then out to the limbs. So that's why there is hierarchy. The idea for that observation comes from that there is something in your brain which we call a schema or plan, and that idea comes from, let us say, let's take an example, sort of like handwriting, in which you might do that kind of interventions in the school system. So usually we learn our handwriting through our dominant hand, right? And then you write your signature and all these kinds of things. So that's we call the hand of acquisition. However, if I put sort of like a pencil on your left hand or in your toe or in your mouth or anywhere like in your body, and it's movable parts, you will be able to produce sort of like an identifiable signature of yours. So that's why we can go to a sea beach and can sign our name with our toe on the sand. Now the question is, where did it come from? You never used your toe to practice writing or doing anything, or you can put your, like, although there could be, you can write your name with your left hand, although it will lose some of the finesse and the character. So that means that say, well, in that case, the program really reside in our brain and it can then flow to any limb we try to use. So from that principle, a thinking may come on, well, in stroke patients or in that kind of patients, it doesn't really matter that which hand you use to acquire something in an manual task, you can easily transfer that task into another hand. So there's a lot of research going on in interlimb transfer and all that kind of task. So that's the adaptive. And so these programs then, depending on the motor goals, can be adaptive and can be generalized, because the strict reflex theory was modified later on. When we discovered other association cortices and find out, well, in different kinds of situations, they can adapt. And one of the good example of that, so for example, let us say the maximum functions we are concerned with OT as an OT is a reaching and grasping function, right? By the way, all our movements, you can like look at all the movements that you can do. All movements are learned. There is hardly any movement which is novel that you performed. So all these movements are sort of, we do become a signature of us. That's why we can identify a laugh, a walk, even 100 meters away. Oh, that is Dr. Buchman coming with that laugh, right? So it is practice through feedback from your teachers, from your parents, and all that kind of things. There is hardly any novel movement. But if I can show you some of the novel movement that is pointed towards nowhere, that could be a novel movement. Since all of these are sort of learned, and so if you think about reaching and grasping movement, so you can reach on top, you can reach all directions, you can reach to the bottom, you can reach to the self, you can grab all these things. Another principle of sort of our motor learning concepts, if you follow all your movements, you will see at least 99% or maybe 99.9% of our movements are object related. That means either you're going to pick up the key or doing something with an object, like pick up the telephone. There is hardly any movement besides pointing to a stars or directionals, which is non-action type, like view, awake. Those are kind of movements which are sort of, those are the verbs that related to no objects, but primarily all our movements are object. But the point is that there is a gazillion type of reaching and practicing, reaching and grasping movements we do in our daily lives. So in the strict reflex theory, if you have to have a reflex for each of these object-related movement, up, down, side, a diagonal, then you have to have a programs, innumerable programs of reaching and grasping. And for that, practically, you need a brain like Atlanta to hold all these programs. So the idea that, well, do we have like a single program for all the movements and learning we do, or there is a general class of program where we adapt and generalized those? So that's the principles, sort of like a hierarchical theory, that yes, there is a plan or there is a scheme for a generalized class of movements, which we can see sort of like reaching and grasping, but this is adaptable, that it can be adaptable. So many of the interventions, you can say, well, does that mean that if I sort of work with my clients to a particular general directions, reaching and grasping type of occupations, can that be generalized to many other reaching, grasping occupations? Your support would be coming from hierarchical theories. Now, remember, are there any questions at this point?
Nothing in the chat box so far.
Good. So there are many who can tell that in hierarchical theory, one thing we really do not pay attention to or do not consider. One flaw in the system, in this theory. Any idea?
So
all right. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. So what was the question? What's the issue with the theory?
like flaw, criticism of hierarchical theory. So far, what we have, like I have discussed. What would be the question that you will question this theory?
If you see one type of dysfunction, it should permeate everything else that causes that kind of movement or similar movement.
Yeah, that's one. Well, that's the basis of this theory, generalizations. But one of the main criticisms of this theory that it is feed forward and it doesn't take into account any feedback. Neither it does take into account the role of environment. But there are a lot. So that's why the people moved to another theory, and which is basically come from, which they call hierarchical theory. And that really comes from, like, if I tell you what it is, you can immediately link that theory into International Classification of Functions, or ICF. So if we think hierarchical theory, it pays primarily attention to the body structure and functions. And since the first 50 years was dominated by the hierarchical theory, you can see majority of the intervention was to improve like personal or body structure and functions, like Rood, Brainstorm, and PNF, all those kinds of things. They try to fix the reflex, didn't pay attention to anything else. Then there is this International Classification of Handicap before 2001, and it changes to functions because everybody start talking about, well, when you say handicap, that means you're separating a class of people as not normal. So then they come up with, well, all functions resides on a continuum. So we are come up with International Classification of Functions and Disability and so forth and so on. However, they introduce three things in considerations of that in that model. So one is the body structure and functions, the other is the activity, and the third is environment. And if you look at our all occupational therapy models, there are some way or a variations of PEO model, the ICF and PEO and etc. And the dynamic system theory basically tells you that your body structures, which is your neuromuscular component, and the environmental factors influence the movement. And the environmental factors I will come to and talk about it just a little bit. And then the movement pattern emerges in the demand of task, which may be at some point dynamic in nature. So if the demand of the task changes in the flight of a movement, your movement will also change because it can continuously monitor the feedback. And so one of the things is that an extreme example would be, let us say, classical dancers, ballet dancers. So they have a task, right? And they have an environment. So they need a certain environment, or the environment, they can do a ballet, and you can see that they can do a ballet on a sea beach, they can do a ballet on a big auditorium, a small auditorium, and all these kinds of things. They can modify. So those movements can be in the demand and affordability of the environment can be scalable. And you need certain neuromuscular functions to achieve that ballet, but it can be a crude ballet to a smooth ballet with practice, which we call functional synergies develop and with practice. So you can go from a simple pattern to a complex pattern of movement with the demand of the sort of like the environment. And as the environment changes, where in our occupational therapy, we can say that that's one way to scale the task up and down, or the environment up and down, etc., so forth and so on. And eventually you achieve sort of a smoother pattern of involving all parts of the movement into sort of like a functional synergistic movement. So the classical difference between hierarchical theory and heterarchical theories is that the hierarchical theory, which came in initially, depend on the reflex chain theory, and it is feed forward, or you can see top to bottom approach. And the heterarchical theory is the bottom up approach. That means your body structure comes first, and then it goes into sort of like the demand of the task and the environment, ultimately in which environment we are performing the task. One of the good examples of that when your task complexity changes drastically, let us say you are doing your favorite activity of drinking your favorite cup of coffee by the side of your window each morning. So the action is drinking a cup of coffee. But suddenly you have been asked by the CEO of your company, or by the president of the company, or some higher up, and says, can you come for a cup of coffee in the morning in my office? I need to discuss something. You are doing the same action, but the environmental affordances or environmental conditions are now changed. And your coffee drinking pattern will drastically change. And that's sort of like one of the examples of the dynamic system theory. That's where environment and tasks sort of interconnected and modified by the body structure. But philosophically, the heterarchical theory or the dynamic system theory also sort of, if you think deeper, then you will see that this theory removes disability from the personal factor into an interactive factor. So before that, before international classification of function, the idea was that whatever the disability you have, it's because it's your personal thing. So you do not belong to the society, get somewhere and all that kind of things. Roads are not built that way. The doors are not built that way. The handles are not built your way, etc., so forth and so on. After the environment and the actions, the researchers found that those are the modifiable factor. And then it comes to the realization disability does not reside into your body. It is the result of an interaction between environmental affordability and your capability on the task we are demanding. A good example of that dynamic system theory and its application in our daily life is that if your job is to go from point A to point B in the airport, and you do not have walking capability, but the environment has a moving platform on which you can jump on and you can go from point A to point B, your function is complete. So there, disability is that the barrier in the environment. You are not really disabled if the environment affordability is there. So in that way, conceptually, disability become an interactive terms outside of your body. So the scientists and the researchers and therapists then started to realize that we can really sort of say somebody is disabled unless we figure out that there is no more scopes from the environment we can give. I stop there before moving to, so that's sort of like I wanted to create a premise for our discussions, giving you some of the thoughts. Are there any questions?
None posted in the chat.
That means I'm talking too much. All right, moving to the next slide. So this is, so then we come to the second principles, or neuroplasticity, but I don't think that I have to spend a lot of time here. It is the reorganization of the brain following repetitive practice. And we will go into the practice principles. So that means we know the structural and functional adaptations within the motor area that happens. And you'll see 2011 and 2012, but I specifically remember one of the, I will give you this, the history of plasticity, make it more interesting a little bit. The Kansas Medical Center, there was a scientist called Ralph Nudo, and who used to work on sort of like a monkey model. And they are trying to find out whether reorganizations happen following stroke. So they did one experiment, which is basically, we can say that this is a little bit cruel. So what they did is that like the monkeys were in a cage, and they have a little sort of like opening in the cage and all those rods, and then the monkey can retrieve food pellet outside from a bowl outside the cage with only dorsiflexion, right, at the wrist. So they have to dorsiflex. They have to put their arms out of the cage and the dorsiflex to retrieve food pellet. And what the scientists did is that they destroyed, with the precision cauterizations, the wrist area of the brain of the monkey, and then forced them to starve in the cage. After 72 hours, so the monkey cannot dorsiflex anymore because that area was surgically damaged. But they found that after 72 hours, monkeys started to dorsiflex. And they went back, without going into the details, and then they went back and saw, and actually a little wrist flexion area was developed around the elbow flexion area in the brain. And that's the beginning of constraint-induced motor therapy protocol. And then that was in 1996, or maybe a little bit 86, around that time. And they then found many, I can go on and give you experiments on experiments that they found that there is a structural plasticity and functional plasticity within the motor areas. There is a numerous in stroke, in CP, in spinal cord injury, etc., so forth and so on. So here you can see in one of the cases here the rerouting of the neurons that can happen following like the damage of one of the neurons. The neurons can sort of create alternate pathways to go to a muscle, and you can know the synkinesis. You can put a sort of like you can take out sort of a twig of nerve from a flexor muscles and surgically plant on extensor's muscle. So that nerve will now behave as an extension nerve rather than as a flexor nerve. It can also, after Wallerian degenerations or peripheral degenerations of a particular neuron, the sort of side neuron, one of the side neurons can develop new dendritic connections. And then that's another and permanent connections. And that is sort of called sprouting. And there is a theory that how these connections and stabilizations of the synapse happen. It's called, after Donald Hebb, Montreal physiologist, and Hebbian stabilizations, probably you have seen. Here in practice, this is the control of a brain fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging. And you can see this is somewhere the central sulcus, midpoint, pre-central area and post-central area. And you can see sort of like a like sensory association cortex, where actually the planning of the movement happens. And you can see following stroke, this was all distributed and they're trying to figure out what to do. And after constraint-induced movement therapy, you can see that the sensory cortex is kind of coming back in a robust way. The same thing happens here in the following stroke, and this is the sort of parietal cortex area, sensory area once again, and the red area is small, and that means there is not much of activity. The red means more activity. And after CMT, you can see the red area has been expanded. That means the activity somehow regenerated. So these type of experiments confirms that through practice and through repeated constrained movement, you can make permanent and adaptable changes. So now after practice, if you don't do practice anymore or don't do that kind of activities anymore, this area will reduce again. So that's the sort of adaptation that happens. So we are sort of going to address some of the principles, but not all 15 of them. And it seems like we'll start from that when learning happens. So all learning, ultimately, when you say that, well, I learned it, what does it mean that I have learned that? Like there are people sort of like argued what actually, when we will say that, well, this is the skill, I really learned it. And then ultimately they figure out sort of like a definitions. If you can automatically execute that skill on verbal demand, then we can say you have learned it. So if I say, well, can you ride the bicycle like without falling, like for 2 miles, you set up a criteria while you can talk, listen, take a telephone and all these kinds of things and do a mental calculation. So you can certain that it can say mental sort of dual task, like while you are doing something else, but you are sort of producing a skill, that's the automatic, that is one of the outcome measures that you can say that the skill is automatic, because the brain doesn't have to pay attention to this skill anymore while it can do something else. So to get to that stage, that sort of first, when you start with teaching something or helping something, the people think there are 3 stages. They're cognitive, associative, autonomous. Now, these, although they call stage, but they are sort of not that, what you can say that it is not that this is not hierarchical in nature. That means you can go only associative stage once the cognitive stage is complete. That is not what you mean. These stages are overlapping. So, and these give you the intervention idea. When you first go into cognitive stage, so first when you want to do something with your patients or client, you go into some sort of discussions. like taking history, what is going on. We are going to work on these things. I think you have deficits, all these things, and then create a cognitive preparation. And that was, I was talking about when the case study. Now, if you see that your client can absorb the cognitive function that is ahead of her or him, it gets easier. Now, how you will sort of give some client idea about a task. And there are a lot of research going on. And one of the things that is, well, let us say that you want to want to enable her in learning sort of like, or let us say, play tennis. And you can do by verbal modeling, you can do by video modeling, and etc. that this is the task we are going to do. Now the question is, do you want to show her a professional tennis player practicing tennis, or do you want to show her an amateur and novice tennis player to show her? What do you guys think? To set up the stage.
Amateur?
Absolutely. And why is that?
Because it would be more at her level of performance, would have more she might have more similar skills that she can adapt to what that person's doing.
Absolutely. And anything else? Any other?
Well, she would be trying to imitate, and watch. So
closer to the Just Right challenge.
Say that again.
She said the Just Right challenge.
Yeah. Anything that your cognitive assessment would be anything that she thinks she can achieve it. If I see that you are showing me something like somebody who is playing at the US tennis, I'm not going to achieve that at all in my lifetime. So you have to go ahead.
Sorry, from the chat box, we have, you're more likely to learn from someone who is similar to you.
Absolutely. That is the right thing. Yes. Which is achievable. So, we all know Csikszentmihalyi's flow concept, and that is actually we can bring in here. So you create that cognitive stage where, and in driver educations, you can see that you have to sit for 4 hours going through different like video examples and lecture. That is similar before you actually drive. So that's your cognitive stage preparations. And then we go into, once that is done, and then you go into associative stage. An associative stage is somewhere you kind of started to solidify practice and those things and try to associate things with that. Any examples? You can give how you can use sort of, so for example, let us say in memory, associative memory or learning is that you tell your friend you're sort of like sitting and chatting and you can say, remember that that guy with the yellow shirt? And said, which guy you're talking about? Remember 10 years ago, we went to Miami Beach and there is this young guy with yellow shirt moving around and playing. Oh, that guy. So that's an associations with an environment. And then when you start to associate like with other environment and all those like other functions and memory and all these kinds of things, it starts to solidify. And then you go into autonomous stage when you can generalize and you can do dual task, other things, and you can perform this skill. You can perform this skill like almost automatically. So the idea is that the stage of learning goes through all three phases, and we can then see that what kind of, so that's the stage of learning. Now we are talking about the task now. So there are different kinds of tasks you can start, simple to complex. So in the task, there is a closed skill and open skill. So a closed skill task is that where the environment is static, and the open skill whether the environment is constantly changing. And in the closed skill, the major difference between those two is predictable and one is unpredictable. What's the advantage of a predictable like task? Anybody? And what is the advantage of an unpredictable task?
For a predictable task, you could practice it and perfect it to an extent more easily than an unpredictable task.
Absolutely. And your and what are, like in our life, what are the predictable tasks? What are the collections of predictable tasks that we do every day?
ADL.
Basic ADL, absolutely. And what is the unpredictable tasks that we do every day?
Novel problem solving.
Yes. And
Driving.
Hmm?
Driving would be an example.
Absolutely. What else?
Having a conversation.
Absolutely, Irma. Absolutely.
And if this is a teacher, then, you know, the reactions to the children and trying to figure out if they're understanding what you're saying and being able to make an adaptation so that they can understand.
Correct. Yeah. All right. Here I give you an interesting facts. Like your closed skills, the predictable tasks are your basic ADL, and your open skills, unpredictable tasks are your instrumental ADL. So anything that you have to negotiate with that instrument, that instrument by itself is unpredictable, which is a telephone conversations Arma is talking about, and driving. The children are playing, anything can happen any moment, right? And really there are two areas in the brain that controls the closed skill and open skills. And when you lose an open skill is more like your executive functions. You need executive functions to carry out your open skills. And you need sort of like a structured automatic skill to do closed skill. And different brain regions govern these two skills. And when you lose your memory towards like sort of like a mild cognitive impairment to Alzheimer's disease, one of the sort of diagnostic criteria whether you are losing your instrumental or your open skills, that goes first. But your closed skill is preserved even until approximately on an average 4 years into the disease. That's why some and actually open skills you can manipulate and cover up. That's why the Alzheimer patients, like they know they have a memory loss, but with their adaptability, they can somehow cover it up, some of the open skills, since they know they can function well with their closed skill. So closed skill, so you have to then think about in the process of motor learning that whether you want to start with a closed skill or you want to start with the open skills, depending upon the cognitive involvement of the patients. So that's the decisions that you have to use, that I want to create sort of like start with these patients with the stroke or other brain functions, etc., like compromised, Should I start with a closed skill, or should I start with an open skill and see how can I cognitively capture? Yeah, this is the basis of how to treat co-occurring brain. Yep, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. So that's why the cognitive stage and associate stage and autonomous stage, those things. So that's sort of one of the struggled area. That's why a fully cognitive assessment is absolutely needed. And if you find a good cognitive assessment standardized like MOCA and all these kinds of things, Montreal Cognitive Assessment Set, it will be highly useful to use that assessment to start like planning your interventions. Emily, we can go to the next.
So I have in the chat box, this is the basic of how to treat co-occurring brain and spinal cord injury diagnosis. Many advanced clinicians struggle with this.
Yeah, I know. Yep. So the next stage in the memory is some of the other principles that you have to really create a memory. So all this motor planning, the basic foundational principle that you have to create some sort of memory. And not only you have to create the memory, you have to retain the memory. And the people say that your retention is actually increased if you overlearn it. Because so the memory you keep by practice, and retention, you test it after the practice, and there is a window when you should like sort of assess the retention. Is it immediate after the practice, or you should give a gap of 48 hours or 1 month or so and see what is the retention of that skill. And then like you continue to do practice so that overlearning happens, right? And in overlearning, the retention is better. Why do you think like overlearning is necessary to form the foundation of a memory or a skill? Why do you want to overteach a client?
To avoid superficial learning, because
Absolutely.
if you do, you're retaining it in short-term memory opposed to encoding it on long-term.
Mm-hmm. Anything else?
You want to be able to carry it over contextually.
You can carry it over contextually, absolutely. What else?
Improve processing speed.
Yeah, absolutely. All those things are true, but it also allows you to make errors. So we all make error. Like, for example, think about the soccer. They practice on penalty kick, if you know the rules, or try to put the ball in that 3 sort of bar, the practice, still the miss. But the probability of success increases over the practice. So allowing for error in a skill is an important aspect of learning, because error will happen because when you go from closed skill to open skill, because of the dynamics are changing, but you should be able to correct the error as quickly as possible if you learn the system well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so would that be then where error detection comes in?
Yes, absolutely. The feedback comes in. You're absolutely right. Yes. Mm-hmm. And that goes in line with the dynamic system theory. Yes. Thank you. Next one. Is this mine, Emily?
Yes, you have a couple more. Mm-hmm.
Couple more. All right. I'll go fast. Right. So there are many more principles, and at this point, probably I will. Well, can I? No, I cannot share now. So, how do you? I will talk very briefly about what's the outcome measures, how you know, and then the two things in motor learning is extremely important. That is speed and accuracy. When you say, when did you think you learned the skill? You can perform the skill with accuracy and faster. So the speed of response and executions are those two important aspects. So can you do it faster within the same time without compromising safety? So there are many assessments of that. And the other is process measures. That means how do you do, et cetera, so forth and so on, which is movement kinematics, do this way, do that way. That is one way to measure that, which is also and you can give feedback on that, which is called knowledge of performance. On the other hand, you can say, well, you really need to go there within 5 seconds and without falling, like 15 times on the way you go. So that's, you are talking about accuracy and speed. And you can also give feedback on that end goal, which is called the knowledge. What is that called, Emily?
You said of the end goal, that's knowledge of
results. Right?
Sorry?
Knowledge of results.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So both are equally important to determine the degree of learning. The next one. And you can design sort of like, if you want to, you can do a pre-post design of your client. And this is how you generate evidence at your place. So you do a pre-assessment naturally, then you do the interventions, and then you do post for evaluation and re-evaluations, etc., and set your next goal. Now the question is, there are two things you want to measure: that whether that person really retain that skill that the person learned, one, and can that person be able to transfer and generalize into other skills. Remember, you need to develop that adaptable schema in hierarchical theory. In some way, because if we take a little bit of knowledge, because we have to have that schema or programming, an idea and cognitive plan of generalized movement so that it can transfer to different kinds. So in the picture, the person is trying to work on a balanced posture as well as walking. Now, can this one transfer into different surface level working, going upstairs, going down the stairs, etc., so forth and so on. Yeah. So the concept, this is you, right, Emily?
Yes, I believe so. Mm-hmm.
So before go ahead.
Yeah, so it says, so the person with Alzheimer's could navigate a home and community, but they go on vacation and get lost at a hotel.
Correct, correct. Because that's then the sort of like they go into open skill format, in an IADL format, unpredictable. In a predictable environment, they do fine. Unpredictable, that's. But also it gives you some sort of idea that what kind of intervention plan I should have. Am I working on the cognitive aspect of the skill or more motor aspect of the skill? Thank you very much. I will shift it to Dr. Buchman.
Thanks, Dr. Maitra. So we're going to shift over to interventions now and apply a lot of the information that Dr. Maitra just spoke about. So just up front, we can think about different aspects of our treatments. So the person, Dr. Maitra framed it very well that we need to differentiate the factors that are going to limit motor performance. So we have to differentiate those that are related to the motor system versus other systems. So he framed really nicely how the cognitive system, cognitive perceptual issues are really going to influence our clients' abilities to carry out functional tasks. And so we have to know what systems we're really trying to impact with our interventions, and then also how that's going to serve as a limitation. So I think someone mentioned that it's really hard to treat, spinal cord injury with brain injury comorbidly because of that the cognitive challenge of understanding tasks of motor movement. So we have to consider the person. We also have to consider the task. So we'll talk about how we modify practice conditions, and then how we're also intentional about how we set up the task and promote different task performance in our clients by, how we set up the task for efficiency, how much practice we have them do, and then the type of feedback that we give as therapists. And then we also then are looking at the environment. So Dr. Maitra talked about, open and closed skills and static and more unpredictable settings. And so we can make those considerations in our environment as well as we set up for successes for our clients. So this is just a rendition of how a lot of the different systems of systems in the body are going to impact and play into motor performance. So we talked a good bit about cognition. So for instance, if somebody does not have attention, then they're not going to even be able to attend to the task, perhaps, that you're trying to have them do. So then how is that going to feed into their motor performance? So, as a clinician, we have to think about how we're going to mitigate these factors if they're present. How can we perhaps set up an environment that might, encourage participation? So in the instance of attention, do we need to treat in an area that is going to hopefully be less distracting for the individual? If somebody has low arousal, again, that's going to be a problem for just participation. So we have to take that into account as well. When we looked at Barb in the beginning, can you guys think of any factors that are playing into her motor performance that we described in the video?
Her neglect could impact her motor performance with ADLs if she doesn't realize she's missing something or doesn't have awareness of it.
Sure, absolutely. So we have that kind of, cognitive perceptual gap. I think somebody initially mentioned too some strength limitations perhaps. So if you guys recall, she was, her range of motion and or strength was limited by her, when she was reaching up as well. So that's how we're talking about, her kinematic movement pattern was challenged.
Yeah, we have a kind of a second of that. The left arbitrary range of motion and strength, and then her motivation positively influencing.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I think absolutely her motivation. I agree with whomever said that. So think about those clients that we have that maybe we can't elicit their motivation, or we just haven't quite figured out what motivates them and how their participation is subsequently impacted, versus those clients who are intensely motivated to improve and will try any crazy idea you have, or even try to do more. And sometimes that can be problematic also. But, oftentimes when we're talking about practice, if they, are practicing, hopefully that's going to help with motor return.
Rebecca also added that if she is leaving the home exercise program everywhere, it may be cueing her cognitively to remember to do her exercises.
Mm-hmm.
And then a lot of research goes into high responders versus low responders in motor return.
Mm-hmm. great. So you guys are really kind of integrating all the factors, into the neurologic condition, which is nice because that's what makes it complicated, but pretty exciting too. Great. Okay, so here moving forward, this is kind of going to be the roadmap for the rest of this session. So this is just kind of a roadmap for intervention planning. So we're going to talk about the mode of instruction, and we'll talk about that as being kind of generally the comparison between being more prescriptive versus using guided discovery as an approach. And then these sections in blue then are sort of like the methods that we use in rehab. So we have these general overall teaching learning principles with the mode of instruction. Then we apply more specific methods like conveying information, how we structure practice and provide feedback. And then in the orange boxes below then are a little bit more of the specifics and the detailed ways in which we can carry out these methods. So we'll kind of keep referring back to this as we go through each section. So when we look at the mode of instruction, this is kind of like just an overall teaching learning concept, basically. So are we going to take a more hands-on approach, or will we be more hands-off? So if we are having that hands-on approach, are we constantly correcting someone's balance because we fear that they're going to fall? Or do we, maybe stand by assist and hover and guard as we're working on balance or different activities, so that if they, kind of fall off center their body, they can learn how to correct and solve that error. So when we are more prescriptive and do hands-on, oftentimes that's going to lead to more inefficient solutions because we are becoming part of that person's environment. So if we are constantly hands-on, they don't have that opportunity again for error correction and for them to try and figure out how they need to change their response to whatever has, say, altered their balance or altered their movement pattern. So there's definitely room for hands-on, and in particular in the beginning when people are just trying to figure out how to move or what is the targeted goal, what's the exercise that we're doing. And it will lead to more efficient learning initially during practice. But again, we're looking for motor learning. And as Dr. Maitra highlighted, that's due to repetition and practice, and then really learning the skills so that they can elicit it across contexts and across situations. So there's room for both, definitely, because sometimes we have those clients that aren't going to be able to have, the different capabilities to move. And again, that helps in the beginning. And so if you look at this image with the, the little girl riding the bike, she's not going to, if her father, that's her father, continues to hang on and hold on to her, you can tell she's already slightly off kilter there. But if dad pulls her back, how does she ever know how to respond when she starts to teeter one way or the other? So that's just something to think about as, the way in which we approach our clients during treatment. So that's in contrast to then this guided discovery or more hands-off approach. So in this image, the girl is, riding freely. If she veers off course and goes into the grass, she's going to either fall, which we obviously don't want our clients to do, but she's either going to fall or figure out how to self-correct and pull the bike back on the pathway. So obviously safety with our clients is of utmost importance, but we also have to be considering our decisions and how that's impacting their ability to figure out their movement patterns themselves through that experience that they need to have. So when you do more a hands-off approach, you're going to develop skills that can be more adaptable. They might be more unique to that person because they are figuring out their pattern of movement on their own without us telling them exactly how to do it, in which direction and which way to move. So it's really more exploratory. And so it may stay with them longer and also lead to like that automaticity that we want, so that again, they can carry it over across contexts and in different situations. So the downside of this is that it might result in less efficient learning initially. And we have to embrace that, maybe that slow nature of that practice, because we are allowing that freedom and that exploration. If somebody is reacquiring a skill and something that they did, automatically before, but we are teaching them, like we're helping them to relearn that, then they have to figure that out. And so we have to embrace the fact that that might take more time and take more problem solving initially. And sometimes I think, particularly as a new clinician, I mean, I was guilty of that. It's very hard. You want to provide suggestions and help, and share your experience and what was successful before. And that's not wrong necessarily either, but we just need to use like all of our skills judiciously to make sure that we're, doing our best for our clients. So, the way in which then we teach and, share information, we can do that then again through different methods. So we can, help to set up situations for observational learning. So as clinicians, the question is like, how do we instruct the client on what we want them to do to meet their client-centered goal, what they set for therapy? So we, oftentimes will give a demonstration of a skill of, what we're teaching them, what we want them to do. We also concurrently give verbal instruction. So in that way, we're giving a lot of, feedback in different sensory modalities. So we may give them visual feedback, then also verbal instruction. And so, the idea with observational learning is that, again, if you go back to that social learning model, we can help them to, achieve those skills through observation by demonstrating. So there's power in modeling. And as we talked about before, some of the premises behind models is that the model should be closer to the individual. I believe somebody spoke about that in the audience. And so, peer support is really great if you can have that, if you can have somebody. I know sometimes in my practice area before, it's in spinal cord, but I couldn't replicate not having abdominals no matter how hard I tried. It was just one of those struggles. So it's harder than replicating hemiparesis, I feel. And so sometimes when I just couldn't get somebody to, do the movement components I wanted, I would have somebody who was more similar to that individual come in and show how they might have performed a movement or an activity. And oftentimes that model then could give the person a guide because they had more awareness of their body and their movement, and I just couldn't replicate it for them. So that was, of great benefit a lot of times to the clients. But when we're working, when you're teaching a hemi dressing technique, obviously, if your client is one who's saying, well, you can move your arm, it's you try and at least mimic, not being able to move it so that they can really internalize what are those movement patterns, and you can be closer to what they are actually showing as well. So learners tend to focus more on the general patterns of movement when they are watching and observing. So a lot of times in the beginning, I can't tell you how many times you showed a sock aid and people just figure that out and needed a lot of repetition with how to do that. But, oftentimes when they're observing, they're focusing on the general patterns of coordination. So because of that, it's often more effective early in learning and may not be as effective as a tool when you're trying to really refine movement patterns and when people have already kind of figured out what it is they need to do. Now they're just trying to figure out how to do it more efficiently or with improved accuracy. That may not be as strong of a tool to use. Do you guys have thoughts about that or have experiences with that relate to that?
This is not therapy, but when I used to coach a lot of basketball, I found that kids that had older siblings that played and they had watched so many hours of their older siblings playing basketball, they just had better court awareness. And I think it was literally from just sitting in the gym, but then that tended to even out and you didn't see differences regarding siblings or not with them as they got toward high school.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense, right? You take in so much information, regardless of what you're watching. So, so moving on in structuring practice, then we have different options too for how to vary practice, and we're teaching a lot of different skills to people oftentimes when they're in rehab for something, and so we have to be cognizant of how we're going to approach those practice sessions, because as we talked about, you do need a lot of practice, and you can set it up in different ways to facilitate different types of learning. So you can have constant practice or variable practice. So you could have somebody, repetitively practice that skill. You don't change the situation. It's pretty static. And so the practice conditions are consistent for that individual. And so what you find though, when you do that, is that it does support performance. And so we want to differentiate that between learning. So they might, through repetition of, say, if you were having somebody brush their teeth, and you say, okay, we're going to brush our teeth 5 times, or you have somebody hanging clothes, doing a repetitive activity of hanging clothes on a rack or something like that, where you don't alter the placement of where they have to reach or the placement of where they have to grab clothes, then they might demonstrate improved performance during that session. And so they may become more efficient with it, or they may have increased speed of completion. But then if you went back again to the retention, so would they be able to do that as with as good of a movement pattern or as efficiently in the next session? That's not necessarily what they show with just kind of constant practice for longer term retention and learning. So variable practice is when you practice then in a variety of contexts, and when you perhaps change the task characteristics. So, if you're doing that in the context of, say, different occupations, hopefully that's going to support more longer term learning and retention over time. So if you were going to alter, say, the task characteristics, and your activity was to put on a pair of shoes, have somebody put on their shoes, then you may have them put on, let's say if it's a woman, they may have to put on their sneakers that have ties. They may have shoes that have Velcro or like belt straps. They may have high heels. They may need to put on their hiking boots, they may have to put on their tall, dress boots and things like that. So all different task characteristics, those are going to have different, skill sets with them if you're manipulating clasps or different closure types. So you would want to, that would be variable practice with varying the task characteristics. So that's obviously going to be more complicated for the person with movement, and potentially if cognition is involved as well, just trying to figure out all those differences. But that's going to lead to, improved and support learning over time and carryover. If you vary context, you want to make sure that the person is not just able to brush their teeth in the setting in which you're in. If you're in inpatient or acute care, they can brush their teeth at the sink in the hospital because all the supplies are set up for them, or they stay where they are. But then you still want them to be able to complete that same task at home, or if they go stay at a hotel and they have to retrieve them out of their travel bag, that adds another layer of complexity, but again, allows them to, manipulate the faucet handles that maybe are different, or, problem solve the fact that they don't have a cup available to them. So all those alterations and changes and making variability in practice is what's going to support kind of long-term retention. So just as a quick example of, constant versus variable, you have, you can reach and grasp the same glass, you can change, put it back at the same spot, even make a mark on the table, do it with the same speed, and that's pretty much constant practice. So you're doing the same reach pattern. versus, you know, changing up the size of the cup, how much water is in it, the weight of the glass, using a styrofoam cup, and altering all those task parameters. And so that's going to be more the variable practice. And I think as clinicians, we figure out that just right challenge for the person to meet them where they're at based on their current capabilities. And then we can hopefully continue to upgrade and make that more challenging so that it does carry over. So you may also see, by the way, massed practice. And so there is, along with the structuring task practice, you might see massed practice and distributed practice. And so there is also consideration for how much time you give between those breaks. So, you know, when you do mass practice, you're not really giving a lot of rest in between each repetition. And then with distributed, it would be when you actually give breaks in between. It seems like there's not a lot of conclusive evidence as to how much space is needed in between sessions. But I didn't know, I was going to open up just to see if anybody had any experiences either way that, you know, seemed advantageous versus others. Has anybody found kind of the massed practice without rest to be super beneficial or frustrating for your clients?
I think you see quality of movement decrease after you hit the limit for them, especially like you see so much proximal compensation and all those accessory movements that they don't need to be putting online.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the altered kinematics kick in after that. Yeah, and I feel like also sometimes it gets just so repetitive and I don't want to say disinteresting, but you know, sometimes depending on what you're doing, I suppose. So along with then kind of another way to classify is then the blocked practice and random practice. So this kind of piggybacks onto the variable practice. So with block practice, it's when you have low contextual interference. So it's basically when you can practice more than one task during a session. And so it's sort of like prevents that memory from solidifying. So if you are, if you're altering things, so say you're doing blocked practice and you're doing one activity, so you repeat one skill several times, then you might do another skill afterwards several times and then another skill. So you're giving them repetition with that single skill, but then altering it. That's low contextual interference. They get repetition of that same skill, even though you're mixing up and doing multiple skills in a session. And that does lead to better performance because again, they're getting that repetition of the same activity over and over, but again, not necessarily as much retention. So if you come back and test them 2 days later, the movement may have degraded and they may not have that pattern down as securely as they did during that performance. So what's usually more recommended later in treatment anyway, is random practice. And so this is when you do, it's random, right? So you do skills in a random order set so that then they really can't call upon that repetition of that immediate skill to call upon that for movement. So when it's particularly later, once people already have the idea of the skill, then random practice tends to lead towards better retention and transfer. Whereas you may do more block practice in the beginning, just when the person is trying to figure out the skill. So, you know, say you're doing, you know, some fine motor work and you're doing sorting pills as one fine motor task, and you're doing shoe tying and you're doing buttoning a shirt. So then if you did block practice, you would have them do that multiple times in a row. So 5 sets of sorting 10 pills, and then followed by tying a shoe, and then followed by buttoning, versus just randomly assorting throughout that session. And so, so overall then what we've come up with is that like the variability of practice and then having random practice are also supportive of motor learning. Again, when we have you know, when we've moved forward a little bit from those initial stages of figuring out what we want to do. And then another consideration when you structure the task practice is whole learning versus part. So are we going to do the whole activity from start to finish? Or are we going to do kind of like our task analysis and break down one component of it at a time? And so again, you can have in the beginning where you may have to break down component skills into parts if it's just too much for the person to do altogether. So definitely in the cognitive world, sometimes this can be challenging to piece together and sequence the whole task. But also from a motor learning standpoint, that can be hard to just from the movement components. So, so both can be effective learning tools overall. And, you know, we talk about different kind of behavioral techniques like chaining. So doing, you know, forward chaining and backward chaining. So if you're doing part learning, a lot of times you can do it in sequence. And this only really makes sense if there's kind of steps that you can break down with that skill, you know, all together. If you can kind of do that activity analysis. So, you know, if something I would maybe want to be able to do if I lost some function would be to make pancakes in the morning on the weekends. And so say, for instance, you know, like making pancakes, I could go from start to finish, making the batter, you know, doing flipping the pancakes, putting them on a plate, serving them at the table. So I could do that whole task, or I could just break down one component that's problematic for me. So say, for instance, I'm having problems with supination, pronation of just flipping those pancakes. I can break that down. I could add variability to that task. So I could, you know, if I wanted to just work on that motor skill, I could flip hamburgers, which would be a heavier weight than a pancake oftentimes. I could use a different shaped spatula handle, which would like change the grip to a bigger grip or a smaller grip. Or I could use a metal flipper versus a plastic flipper. So I could change some of those task parameters to add variability. And then I could also add like random practice. I could, you know, focus on supination, pronation, which is my problem during different activities. So if it was still in the context of making breakfast, I could maybe have someone scoop the coffee grounds into the coffee maker. So that would encourage pronation, and then supination and pronation again. I could have them pour cereal into a bowl for breakfast. I could have them just do the mature feeding pattern, which requires supination, pronation. So all those different component skills could support that movement component that I want, but do it in a random practice way. So we could set up lots of different activities to encourage variability and random practice. We can do it via part learning or via whole learning, depending upon what it calls for our client. Does that make sense with structuring practice? And I think I'll skip that one. Are there any questions on that one? Okay, and then I know we're nearing our time, so I'll zip through these last ones. Okay, and so then last, providing feedback, and we already talked about this just a little bit. So, so we can have, again, knowledge of results or knowledge of performance. And so how we respond to our client as a therapist can impact their motor learning and how much retention they have and different qualities of movements and different things depending upon how we give them that feedback. So overall, we do want to be giving feedback so they're not blind, obviously. And it can also help with increasing their motivation. So just positive reinforcement, right? So there's intrinsic feedback that people get also just by virtue of completing the task. So they're going to get somatosensory feedback from whatever activity they're doing. But then we also supplement that with the external feedback we give. So sometimes you'll hear it as like augmented feedback. So, so we can provide knowledge of results, and that's just really going to provide the, or describe the outcome again. So if it's just, completing your morning care routine, so getting dressed, putting your shirt on and your pants on, or if it is doing a load of laundry or playing a game of cards. So it's somewhat intuitive in the sense that the person already knows really if they've completed the task or not. But we can also give that supplementary feedback too, which is can be reinforcing to the individual, obviously, and pointing out their successes. So, we can say, great job lifting, that box to the table, for instance, in this slide. Or, that was a great way that you wrote your name, for instance. So the child is going to know he wrote his name when he sees all the letters formed. But again, we can give that knowledge of results feedback. We can also give knowledge performance. We're talking about movement patterns. So this is when we actually highlight the quality of the movement. So I think Kristen just mentioned how sometimes we get degradation of movement over time. So as people fatigue or, just do tons of repetitions, they just may not look as good as they used to. So we might describe the quality of their movements because we want to focus in on what their movement patterns are and maybe try and remediate some kind of reach pattern, let's say, so that they have kind of like a better kinematic, movement pattern. So in here, then we're bringing attention to the performance characteristics and to the person. So, bringing it back to these examples, we might say, keep your back straight while you're lifting, or you pressed really hard on the pencil while you were writing your name. So that's feedback about their performance, how they went about doing it, not just the outcome of what happened. So with, we can give that feedback concurrently while the activity is going on, or we can also give it at the end as terminal feedback. And so overall, both can be effective. It looks like, the knowledge of results tends to be a little bit more favored in the literature in the sense that not so much focusing on the kinematics of movement and what people do, but actually like on their targeted goal and outcome. So, so we want active learning in the client. So we want them to be able to evaluate their own performance and note their own errors. So we can give that feedback in such a way that allows them to, again, engage their cognitive processes and really think about and evaluate their own performance. And so, we may, instead of being, again, prescriptive and directive and telling them how to alter their movement or their pattern, we may ask them like, how do you think that went? And what would you do differently next time? Or, what do you think went wrong with that, to try and engage, again, that cognition so that they can engage in, evaluation of their errors and then try and change that for the next one. So generally, it's kind of hard to do, I think, personally, but less frequent feedback usually leads to higher retention. And then, also, again, giving people time to, to figure out their errors and try and correct them. So we can give general feedback, we can give specific feedback, we can give more quantitative feedback if we wanted them to do a certain number of repetitions. We can give more qualitative feedback based on their movements. We can focus the attention on the task at hand, so more internal attention or external focus of attention. And then again, we can point out errors. We can, again, prescribe changes, or we can try and have them problem solve through as well. So motor learning becomes more in their hands. So when we give clinical feedback, just some general recommendations would be to give more feedback when you're initially trying to perform something and then fading or slowing down your feedback as people are going and doing more and more of that practice that we talk about. Again, fading, so you can do some of those other kind of behavioral techniques like we do. You can summarize feedback instead of giving like direct feedback after every trial, and then try and give descriptive feedback so that they can kind of figure out how to alter their movement rather than giving them the direct recommendation. So overall, some factors that influence the emerging behaviors, then we've got, client factors, task, and environmental factors. So, we talked a lot about cognition. We alter the way we we instruct, we give maybe more brief instructions, more specific instructions. We can take into account, the physical factors of the client. So we may have to provide more support at the upper extremity, for instance, if they have weakness or range of motion issues. We may slow the pace or downgrade an exercise if we see that there's any kind of emotional distress, just to make it to increase their motivation and to make it the just right challenge. We alter the conditions of the tasks and the rules. We might alter how many repetitions or how we set up something for somebody. How fast do we want them to complete it? We oftentimes alter the time and space. So do we give them rest in between? Do we alter the task, that they're working on while they're working on the same type of skill? Do we have them transfer, say to a bed, to a toilet, to a tub? So how do we use our objects? I think we're, as OTs, that's kind of what we do, right? And so we're just sort of framing it and putting it into context of motor learning. So, we just think about how we set up the environment for success, and how we alter things so that we can provide that just right challenge to the client. So some approaches that are really supported by the literature in relation to motor learning: task-oriented training, constraint-induced. We talked a little bit about mirror therapy. There are some others too. There was a review that also talked about like robot-assisted training and electrical stimulation, even different mixed approaches in virtual reality. So there are quite a few treatments out there right now that kind of adhere to the motor learning principles that have pretty strong research backing for. So I know it's already 10 o'clock, so we would have talked about Barb a little bit more, but hopefully through the course of this, we had a sense of evaluating her, and hopefully you can take home some of these concepts then and think about how you would treat her or any of your own personal clients. So I know Dr. Maitra, I think you wanted to, I can stop screen sharing if you want to show that, that review. Did you want to do that quickly?
Sure.
Okay.
Just for a, I'll show the share screen.
On the bottom, you can hover.
You see it?
Yes.
So this is the one I was talking about. It says principles of neurorehabilitation. So you can take a screenshot, and it's Frontiers in System Neuroscience. I'll put this, and it is available freely. And here they're actually talking about identified 15 principles, mass practice, which Dr. Buchman and Emily talked quite a bit, spaced doses, action observations, and this is the last thing I think interesting, social interactions. They have found that stroke recovery is faster if they have chances to interact socially. All right.
Great lecture.
Great. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for your participation and for listening tonight so late. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
And if you have any questions, we can stay on, but I realize we're after time, but we're here for anything if you have questions or comments.
Thank you all.
Don't forget to fill out your surveys to get your continuing ed credit.